This show is produced by the Hartman Media Company. For more information and links to all our great podcasts, visit hartmanmedia.com.
Welcome to The Commercial Investing Show, where we analyze, explain, and exploit the opportunities presented in today's commercial property marketplace. If you're interested in apartments, mobile home parks, self-storage facilities, and other income property, you've come to the right place. We'll explore what's hot and what's not in markets nationwide in the relentless pursuit of return on investment. Here's your host, Jason Hartman.
Thank you for joining me today. Well, some of you out there have been asking, isn't there anything else going on in the world besides this, what is it called? Oh, coronavirus. That's it, right? Yes. Most of you have heard of that by now. Isn't it crazy that I bet pretty much the entire planet has heard of this? I mean, there are a few things like that, and this is one of them. But you asked, hey, can we talk about something else? Okay, today you are going to get your wish. We won't be focusing on the world economy going into hibernation mode. We won't be focusing on the recession that we are already in. We won't be focusing on the contagion and the exponential growth potential of it and these ludicrous comparisons that some people are putting on social media to the regular flu and things like that. Okay, fine, we won't. We got a great show for you today, folks. This interview that I did just over a week ago is excellent, and it's a big guest. Former president and CEO of Sotheby's, former chairman of Lehman Brothers Holding Company. That means he was responsible for distributing the assets after the collapse of Lehman Brothers. This is a fascinating interview. You're going to like it, okay? And it's not all about that virus thing, okay? So you get to take a little break from it. Heck, you got enough of that on every other news media out there, okay? So we'll take a break from it. But I do want to announce something. I want to announce, most all of you know and follow my 10 Commandments of Successful Investing. And of course, somewhat sarcastically, there are actually 21 commandments in the 10 Commandments. I know, it's like government math here, folks. It's fuzzy math. Anyway, we are about to announce Commandment number 22. Drum roll. Should I tell you now? Or can you wait for Commandment number 22? Maybe we'll talk about it tomorrow. I think we'll keep you in suspense. I think we'll talk about it tomorrow, because tomorrow we'll probably play one of the interviews where I talk about this. And you know what? It's actually Commandment number 22 to be announced is actually something that relates to another commandment. And it's in the first 10, by the way. It relates to that, but now with the health scare, with COVID-19, there is a new reason to think about this. And actually, I predicted this, and I think now this prediction is a kind of an easy one to make. I'm predicting it even more so, and that is this new migration pattern that is going to benefit real estate investors that have been following my plan. Migration patterns will change. This event will change the world for at least a generation. Okay? It will change the world for at least a generation. And remember, coronavirus won't be the last viral outbreak. And we've had them before. Fortunately, they weren't as significant as this one, at least not since the Spanish flu 100 years ago. But, we had H1N1, we had the bird flu, the swine flu, right? We've had these things, okay? But this one being far more significant. And this one is going to change a lot of habits. And in my first 10 commandments, I unknowingly was recommending a tangential part of Commandment number 22. And I think we'll announce that tomorrow. But this interview does not give me a lot of time to do a big intro today. So look, everything's in the news. We're going to be covering more of this stuff. We're going to have Chris Martenson on Flashback Friday. He's been covering the coronavirus thing extensively, but we're going to do a flashback show because he's been on the show several times. Peak Prosperity, Chris Martenson, he did the crash course many years ago, and I think you'll find Flashback Friday interesting as well. But tomorrow, for Wednesday, we will go back into it. We will talk about Commandment number 22 and how it's going to benefit all of you who have been following my investing philosophy. So that is coming tomorrow, but today we got a fantastic interview. You're really going to like this interview. So enjoy it as we talk about Sotheby's, as we talk about Lehman Brothers, and we look back on what history just 10 years ago can teach us about what we are going into right now. What we are going into right now is a different flavor for sure, but definitely a global recession. So I think this will be educational to you from a historic perspective for sure. If you need us, reach out to us, jasonhartman.com. That's jasonhartman.com or 1-800-HARTMAN. Get a hold of one of our investment counselors. Have them help you make adjustments to your portfolio so that you can invest properly to not only survive, but thrive in pandemic times. jasonhartman.com. Okay, let's go to the interview. It's my pleasure to welcome Michael Ainslie. He is the former president and CEO of Sotheby's and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. He's former senior director of Lehman Brothers and then became chairman of the Lehman Brothers Holding Company, or the Lehman Brothers estate, if you will, and oversaw the sale and disposition of the company's remaining assets to Barclays. He's author of a new book, A Nose for Trouble, Sotheby's, Lehman Brothers, and My Life of Redefining Adversity. Michael, welcome. How are you?
Thank you. I'm very well. Nice to be with you, Jason.
It's a pleasure to have you. Where are you located?
I live in Palm Beach, Florida. That's where I am today.
Well, we're neighbors because I live in Palm Beach, Florida, too. So, small world.
It is small.
It is a beautiful, beautiful day here, isn't it?
It really is.
Good stuff. Boy, I bet you have some stories to tell. Now, Sotheby's was before Lehman's. I'm guessing, right?
That's correct. I was
right.
CEO of Sotheby's from the mid-'80s to the mid-'90s.
Fantastic. And when someone says Sotheby's, most people think of the auction house. Nowadays, in the retail world, we see the real estate company. Was it sort of those two businesses, or I'm guessing there were even more businesses?
Well, there was also a finance company, a financial services business, but by far the majority of the business was and still is the auction side of Sotheby's. That's a worldwide business in 85 countries, and it actually was just bought about 2 months ago by a Frenchman named Patrick Drahi for a very big price. He paid $3.7 billion for Sotheby's.
Wow.
He's got a job to do to make it worth that.
Wow. So Sotheby's, how did they become such a big player in the art auction? And were they the biggest, or was Christie's ever bigger, or how did those two compare and compete?
Well, it's a good question. When I got there in the mid-'80s, we were about even with Christie's, and we were about $600 million in sales. But I quickly learned that we were really selling mostly to art dealers. We did not sell a lot to private collectors like the art market is today. So we set about changing that and really building if you will, a retail business of selling to art collectors directly. And that made a dramatic change in our fortunes. We became much bigger than Christie's. We were about 65% of the market in a few years. And we also grew from 600 million up to 3 billion in sales very quickly. So, and we did it with very simple things, staying up on weekends, getting our catalogs out a month earlier, traveling exhibitions, providing financing to our buyers and sellers. Mm-hmm. Just some good basic business tactics. And we had the art expertise. Sotheby's had been around since 1742, believe it or not. That was that was the year of its founding. It's one of the oldest businesses still around that have been around for over 250 years.
Amazing, amazing. And we'd think Lehman Brothers was old. I mean, I remember at the time commenting on the fiasco there, and that was like 146 years old, I believe. So we all thought Lehman Brothers was an old company, but Sotheby's was really been around a while. It's amazing.
They had been. It was had wonderful traditions and great talent. Mm-hmm. It just needed a little business strategy and to be nicer to its clients. I've mm-hmm. always found that when you are really good to your clients, you communicate well, you have the practices that they want, they reward you with your business, mm-hmm. with their business. And that's what happened with Sotheby's.
Sure. Yeah. Fantastic. So just curious, how's the art market doing? What's the prognosis for the art market? The economy is going through quite a bit right now, not the least of which is COVID-19 and that scare. But what are your thoughts on the art market? Is that
it's strong. It's buoyant. In a way, our success in the 90s of really making the auction room much more accessible to people literally from every corner of the world has succeeded to such a degree that you never know today whether it's going to be a new wealthy Chinese buyer or a Russian mm-hmm. buyer or an American buyer or a South African buyer. It's just a global market with great and easy communication through the internet and digital catalogs. Yeah. So it's become a place, frankly, where wealthy people can get known very quickly. Part of that is a little bit unsettling because it's become a lot about the ego of the buyer, not so much about the value of the art sometimes.
Right. So when the buyer wins an auction that's, maybe the highest price ever paid for a piece, that's good for their brand, right?
Well, it certainly gives them a high profile in an instant. They become known overnight around the world. Uh-huh. And that, unfortunately, it's leading to a lot of good collectors can't afford to play in the game anymore because these newly wealthy billionaires are buying everything.
Yeah, they just crowd everybody out. Sure. Yeah, that's amazing. Does that tell us that there's just a lot of money sloshing around in the world? And when I say a lot, I mean compared to what it used to be. Is the world getting a lot richer, or is it that the concentration, or maybe there's less concentration really because there's more players? It's obviously more globalized. Just any maybe anecdotal thoughts on that?
Well, I think there clearly are more wealthy people in developing economies all over Asia, China being the leader, but all over Asia. Mm-hmm. Many countries in Eastern Europe now have very wealthy people. And that wasn't the case 30 years ago. This is a new phenomenon. And again, I say the art market and the purchasing of major works of art has become a way for them to distinguish themselves. So the art market, in a sense, has become a proxy for a growth in the really wealthy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really quite interesting. Now, we'll kind of finish up on the Sotheby's topic, maybe. Did you want to talk about the scandal that happened after your departure?
Well, painfully, I will tell you just a little bit about it. I was brought into Sotheby's as CEO by a man named Alfred Taubman, a big wealthy developer from Detroit. He passed away about 3 years ago. Yeah. He was my chairman. And then when I departed after about 10 years, a woman named Dee Brooks was promoted to be the CEO. Unfortunately, the year before I left, she was worldwide chief operating officer, and she began an extensive illegal collusive activity with Christie's, with their CEO. I was completely unaware of this, and the courts later and the Justice Department validated that. Taubman was blamed for making her do it to keep her job. For a lot of reasons, which I detail in my book, I do not believe that to be the case. Dee was an incredibly strong, willful woman. Mm-hmm. She literally had her name on 500 pages of illegal agreements, documents with Christie's that was turned into the Justice Department. Taubman's name was not on one of them. So she blamed him conveniently. He spent a year in jail for the price fixing. She got a ankle bracelet and had to plead guilty to a felony. It really was a very sad chapter, and Sotheby's barely survived. It was a nip and tuck. We lost clients, we lost employees, we lost a lot of money.
Yeah, yeah. What's interesting about that, though, is in something like the art auction business, how do you actually mechanically fix prices? Because all the pieces are different. So,
Well, they didn't fix the price of the art. What they fixed was the price of the commissions. They
okay.
agreed. The two houses agreed on a sliding scale of non-negotiable commission rates. The commissions had always been negotiable, and clients could play one house against the other. Suddenly, they stopped being able to do that. In one way, that's what led to the discovery of it, because a couple of the clients were so upset with this attitude that they called the Justice Department, and they finally got them to pay attention to this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Hey, one other question about Sotheby's, and that's on the real estate side. Tell us a little bit about the real estate company, if you would.
Well, it's grown to be very successful. When I first got there, we were selling what we called white elephants, a lot of very overpriced, very expensive islands and big houses. And frankly, it was not making any money.
Mm-hmm.
We changed that and went to a much more of a franchise model, where there are now hundreds of firms around the world that carry the Sotheby's brand. And there are about 15 Sotheby's owned offices. And it's now a very successful business, and I think provides a unique service because it's able to reach out globally to people that may be interested in Palm Beach or Berlin or wherever, and very quickly they can find properties. A good friend of mine just rented a beautiful home in Italy for the summer through Sotheby's.
Yeah, fantastic. So, Lehman Brothers. Now, when did you start your tenure as a senior director? And then, of course, we all want to hear about the financial crisis and the happenings there. But how early, before all of that, did you start?
I became a director in '96, and of course, the crash occurred about 11 years later. So I was on the board. I knew the company well. We had a great business. We had a great company. It really is a huge mistake that Lehman was allowed to go into bankruptcy. Hank Paulson, clearly made the decision. He made the decision, in my opinion, because he was concerned that AIG, which was teetering on the verge of bankruptcy at the same time, owed Goldman Sachs a huge amount of money. And had they not paid that, Goldman might have been in jeopardy.
Right. So Hank Paulson was Treasury Secretary, and Hank Paulson it seems as though he did not like Dick Fuld, who was CEO at the time. Is that correct?
I think that's an understatement. They did not get along at all.
Yeah.
Back in this is really ancient history, but there had been another crisis in 1998 called long-term capital management.
I remember LCTM, right? Yeah, they thought they had mathematically discovered that there was no way to lose. Boy,
That's
were they
right.
wrong.
They got that wrong, and they basically went under. And Paulson led the effort to salvage it. He came to Fuld and Lehman and asked for $250 million, $250 million. Even back then, that was a lot of money.
Right.
And Fuld, Lehman had not had much to do with, in fact, nothing to do with long-term capital. It was mainly a Goldman protege or project. Anyway, he said no. And finally, after a lot of beating him up, Paulson got him to say that Lehman would put in $100 million. That left a bad taste in Paulson's mouth. He did not like Fuld saying no to him. Most of the other banks on Wall Street said yes at that point. So they had other run-ins. They dealt with each other fairly regularly. We had just taken a great talent away from Goldman named George Walker, who became the head of all asset management for Lehman. So there was a lot of rivalry between the two firms.
Yeah, that's something. And there was, I can't remember, I think there was an actual name for this meeting, but there was sort of an emergency meeting that Paulson convened at the Federal Reserve right on the brink of the financial crisis.
Saturday morning.
And Lehman was not invited, right?
Lehman was the cadaver on the table. They had the 8 top commercial and investment banks, and they divided them into 2 teams and said, you look at the balance sheet and you look at the value of the assets and see if you can come up. They gave him 2 hours. Geithner said, you have 2 hours to save Lehman. Well, needless to say, they concluded that they couldn't, and you couldn't, no way you could analyze a $600 billion balance sheet in 2 hours. So the policy decision was made. And here's another interesting point. It should have been made by Ben Bernanke, who was chairman of the Federal Reserve. It's his job to finance banks and institutions. He delegated that and abdicated and gave it to Paulson, who was a political figure and clearly had a long and close relationship with Goldman Sachs.
Right. Well, he was CEO of Goldman Sachs, wasn't he?
Until not long before this.
Right, exactly.
By the way,
everybody in big government finance positions worked at Goldman at one time or another, seems like.
And he had just sold, less than 2 years earlier, he had just sold his Goldman stock he had to go into the government, which was $480 million of his personal holdings.
Wow, that's something else. So let me ask you to speculate on two different things. And, I'll just tell you where I'm coming from. Like, philosophically, I didn't agree with any of these bailouts. Now maybe practically that was a bad idea, but it kind of felt like corporate socialism. It felt like the big guys were getting bailed out, and why should we do that? And then Goldman, the same year they paid themselves all their big bonuses, and everybody was mad about that. But let's just assume that none of the bailouts happened, and maybe I'm not using the correct word. Maybe you don't even want to call them bailouts. That's what I call them. But let's say they didn't do any of that. What would have happened? Would the world economy have just ground to a halt and been so much worse? Like, just speculate.
Yes.
What would that have been? Just a death march? I mean, what would that have looked like?
It would have made the 1929 crash look like a popcorn party. It would not have been pretty at all. The Lehman board considered not declaring bankruptcy, but we knew that if we did not declare bankruptcy that night and the Fed had refused to lend to us the next morning, there would have been chaos in the world. There would have been many bankruptcies. Goldman Sachs was not far behind. Morgan Stanley and Merrill Lynch were very close to the limit. Look, this all stems back to a lot of bad judgments that were made about the housing market.
Sure.
The government wanted to see more middle and lower income people buy houses.
Yep.
And so they made a huge push to get more and more financing going to those buyers of that market.
And are you referring to the Community Reinvestment Act when you say that, or are you talking sort of generally about it?
I'm talking generally, not the CRA. No, that had some good qualities to it. This was more the use of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the basically subsidizing mortgages, getting more and more people to buy houses with, frankly, mortgages that they couldn't afford.
Right,
and that ended up with what became what's called the subprime crisis.
Sure.
Lehman was not even a big player in subprime. Our big problem was quality real estate. We bought Artstone, a big provider of luxury apartments, right before the crash for $22 billion, and then couldn't liquidate it, couldn't sell it off. That was one of our problems. If your scenario had played out, let me tell you, we'd all be doing something else than living in Palm Beach.
Okay, sure. Well, but what would that have meant to the common man or woman on the street? Like, what would that have meant to the middle class? What would have happened? How would they have? I mean, we all know what happened because we were there. But if there were no bailouts, what would that have looked like?
Well, let me tell you one fact, that there's a really good book out there that I urge your readers and you to look at. The professor, head of economics at Johns Hopkins, is a very bright economist named Lawrence Ball, Larry Ball. And his book is called The Fed and Lehman Brothers. And he looks at it in great depth, much more depth than anyone else has.
Sure.
He also has taken a 10-year after Lehman's bankruptcy look at all of the countries of the OECD, the European Community.
Right.
He concluded that the growth rate in those countries, because of the Lehman bankruptcy, principally the crisis of the 08, that the growth rate in those countries is 8 percentage points lower than it would have been. In other words, those economies have never recovered 12 years later. So you ask what would have happened? huge unemployment, huge disinflation. Values of everything would have dropped.
And is that because financing would have seized up even more than it did? I mean, we felt like it seized up to a large extent, but would it have been more so?
It would have. I mean, look at Japan. Japan has had 20 years of negative growth or no growth. Their financial institutions never dealt with reality. I'm just using that as an example of what would have happened worldwide.
Japan, it's really been more than 20 years, right? I get it.
It started in 1990 because that was the year their art market collapsed. So yes, it's almost 30 years.
Yeah, right.
But I think, let me give you one other argument why I don't call them bailouts. Did you know that the $88 billion that the government ended up financing AIG with was fully paid back plus a $22 billion profit? Did you know that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are both producing literally hundreds of billions of profit for the government for saving them from going under? So these institutions, which are supposed to be financed by the government, one mea culpa. They were all too much. There was too much leverage. There was too much debt.
Too much financialization.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
And I think Dodd-Frank has done a good job of making these financial institutions much less leveraged, and thus they've got much more resilience to the next crash.
Yeah. I agree that at least on the real estate side, the banks have been pretty conservative. It doesn't seem like the next fiasco is going to be at least real estate led. I can say that hopefully with some comfort. Now, the other hypothetical I'd like to ask you is what would have happened had they helped Lehman Brothers like they did with everybody else? They helped Bear Stearns, they helped Goldman, they helped AIG, but they let Lehman Brothers fail. What would have happened had they helped that? Would it have been a much softer landing?
Dramatically softer. When Lehman went under, it had 1,300,000 derivative contracts in place. Those contracts went haywire because they were guaranteed by the parent of Lehman. That cost the shareholders and the debt holders of Lehman literally hundreds of billions, not millions, billions of dollars. I don't think Paulson and Bernanke understood that. The interconnectedness of all these institutions, because those contracts were held by other banks, all of whom came in and tried to put in huge claims after the bankruptcy. That was one of the more interesting parts of my time as chairman of the bank, the Lehman estate, was trying to adjudicate all of these claims that came in from Chase and Citibank and Goldman and all these people. They were feeding at the trough, literally.
Yeah, right. So had Lehman been bailed out, would we have had a Great Recession at all? Or, we were still having bank failures of retail banks. Washington Mutual. Describe how that would have looked had Lehman been saved.
I think that we would have had a much softer recession. Clearly, assets were overpriced. There was too much leverage in the system, and there would have been a lot of other failures. But what happened is banks stopped trusting each other. Banks, there is such a daily interplay between all of these organizations. Let me give you one other example. On the Tuesday before our bankruptcy, Jamie Dimon from Chase, and Chase was Lehman's main clearing bank. They provided our overnight financing. Dimon had a meeting with both Bernanke and Paulson. We don't know what was said in that meeting, but clearly he was given some indication that Lehman was not going to be supported because he called up Dick Fuld and demanded $8.6 billion of additional cash collateral for us to continue operating that week. Well, we're not that big. The $8.6 billion was about 20 or 25% of our liquidity. And once that happened, then other people started calling in claims. So, there was a lot of ugliness that never got told. We sued Chase, and apparently under the fine print of their loan agreement, they had the right to do that. They won that lawsuit about 4 years later. I think Lehman got about $1.5 billion back, but they didn't get the $8.6 that Chase took. So it was very personal. It was very competitive.
That's just something. You know what's most interesting about hearing you speak about this is that this really is, just like every other part of life, a game of friendships, well, friends and enemies. And there's a lot of, I think the way the typical person looks at, the big Wall Street game is it's all numbers and it's scientific and financial, but it's a rivalry. Like Hank Paulson didn't like Dick Fuld, Dick Fuld didn't like Hank Paulson, so that determines the destiny of a giant 150-year-old company, right?
As my grandmother used to say, be careful on your way up to make good friends, because you might need them on the way down.
Yeah. Well, that's an old saying. That's a good one. Hey, I got to ask you about the derivatives market for just a moment, because you mentioned it before. And just the general question I'd like to ask you. I mean, there are signs of real trouble in the economy globally before we even talk about coronavirus, right? There's the repo market. There's a lot of goings on that people, Chinese bank failures, some seemingly pretty serious issues. Is the economy over-financialized now? We both seem to agree that the banks have been conservative underwriting real estate deals, at least in comparison to the way they were before. But, we've got this giant derivatives market, which is like $750 billion, or no, it's more than that. I don't know what
much more than that. I don't know the scale of it today, but
it's trillions and trillions of dollars. Is it over financialized now, or do we have a good balance between what I'll call the real economy and the financial economy?
No, I think we have some serious issues. To me, the biggest one is the underfunded pension liabilities of our major cities and states.
And countries. Don't forget countries.
And countries. And countries, our own included.
Yeah.
We are not addressing, politically, we have just kicked the can down the road, and we have to address these. And in my opinion, there's going to be some very serious problems with some of these states in the Northeast and the Midwest as they fail to deal with this, particularly if rates start to go up at some point. Right now, they can refinance and borrow these deficits at very, very low rates, but that someday will end. I don't know when.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the question, over-financialized, the answer is yes, over-financialized, but biggest problem being the pensions, which is a little different than...
It's a little different.
Financialization.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Good. Hey, anything else you want to say about your book or the Posse Foundation that I think you founded that, right?
Well, I didn't I wasn't the founder, but I was the founding chairman. Let me just say a word about Posse. The Posse Foundation started about 30 years ago when a brilliant young woman named Debbie Beale, who was the founder, I was talking to a bunch of kids who had dropped out of college, and one said, if I'd had my posse with me, I would have been fine. Well, she called up Vanderbilt University, where I'm an alumnus and a board member, and she asked them if they would take a gamble on 6 kids from New York City who would not measure up on their SATs, but would be strong leaders on their campus. Fortunately, Vanderbilt said yes. Those 6 kids came to Vanderbilt and really changed the campus. One of them went on to get her PhD at Duke. She was the daughter of a Dominican cab driver. She went into academic life, and she became the dean of the college at Middlebury. And today, she is president of Ithaca College at 45 years old. Mm-hmm. She is a remarkable woman, and that began a whole process. Today, Posse sends teams of kids from public high schools. These are young leaders from urban schools, not all of them low income, but many are. We've now sent 9,200 kids to college, and they go to the most elite universities: University of Chicago, Vanderbilt, Brandeis, Pomona, Claremont, on and on. 57 universities take a Posse now because these kids come in and they just do amazing things on campus, and 90% of them graduate. So that's been my passion. I've been the chairman for 15 years. I'm now just a board member, but chair emeritus. And Posse has gotten these kids over $1.5 billion of scholarships over the last 30 years.
Yeah, fantastic. Good stuff. Anything else about the book, or just any final comments you want to share? Maybe a question I didn't ask you.
Well, the real reason I wrote the book is for these Posse kids. I also have 5 children of my own and 8 grandkids. And I really wanted them to know that life is not easy. Every day there's something challenging and difficult, whether it's ethical, health-wise. I almost died when I was in high school. I got an autoimmune disease called Addison's disease. It changed my whole life because I went from being a strong athlete and basketball player, and I had to give that up. So I tell a lot of stories in the book about bad things that happened to me, near bankruptcy when I was in my first company back in Hilton Head down in South Carolina in real estate, all of the challenges at Sotheby's and Lehman Brothers. But, you learn from these things. You move forward. You figure out a way to do it better the next time and not make the same mistakes. And you try and be ethical. You try and do the right thing all the time.
Right. And
my belief is people will rally around you and support you, and one can succeed even in spite of these kinds of adversities.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. People who haven't experienced hardships, they haven't tried anything. They haven't gone out on a limb. They haven't taken a risk. Life is a challenge. It's not easy, but every time you overcome a challenge, you become a better, stronger person, and no question about it. And I love how you point out that some of the challenges aren't like challenges in the way many people think of them, Michael. They're challenges in, do I sort of sell my soul to the devil? Do I do the unethical, more expedient thing? Or do I do the thing that's the right thing to do and the long game, the longer strategy, right? The delayed gratification strategy. And, we're faced with those decisions all day long, all of us. It's hard to choose the right one a lot of times, isn't it?
Well, I think it is, but most people really do know the right way to go. And when they stand up and do the right thing, I'm a great believer that then people get excited about working with you and following your lead.
Yeah.
So that's really the purpose of my book, is to say those things to a lot of young people and people our age.
I couldn't agree more. And your website is anosefortrouble.com. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Excellent. Well, the book's available in all the usual places, looks great, and anosefortrouble.com. Michael, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any episodes. Be sure to check out the show's specific website and our general website, hartmanmedia.com, for appropriate disclaimers and terms of service. Remember that guest opinions are their own, and if you require specific legal or tax advice or advice in any other specialized area, please consult an appropriate professional. And we also very much appreciate you reviewing the show. Please go to iTunes or Stitcher Radio or whatever platform you're using and write a review for the show. We would very much appreciate that. And be sure to make it official and subscribe so you do not miss any episodes. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode.